Let us take a moment again as we're starting out to honor the native people who used the Helena Valley as a common hunting ground. It was the Shoshone, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Salish Kootenai. And they hunted here for thousands of years before Lewis and Clark arrived 220 years ago. Members of these and other tribal nations live in this area to this day. I am Sandy Ashley. I am a member of the St. Mary Catholic Community, St. Francis Peace Through Justice Ministry. It's a big mouthful. So, our ministry is based on Catholic social teaching, and it seems like the themes of Catholic social teaching that we most commonly think about are solidarity and the preferential option for the poor. But tonight we're focusing on a different theme. It's the call to family, community, and participation. The United States Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops describes this as, quote, "The person is not only sacred, but also social. How we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. We believe that people have a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good and well-being of all, especially the poor and vulnerable. Our freedoms, including the freedom of religion and our ability to promote social justice and serve the common good, depend on our democracy, our Constitution, and the rule of law." Our speaker tonight doesn't need much introduction for many of you. Nevertheless, I've asked Mick Robinson, a St. Mary Catholic Community parishioner and a longtime friend and colleague of Governor Marc Racicot, to introduce him more thoroughly. Take it away, Mick.
Thanks, Sandy, and good evening to all of you. I first met Mark in 1966 when his family moved to Helena. His father accepted the head basketball coaching position at Carroll College, and Mark started his education, his college education at Carroll that year. Their family, in fact, bought a house about 1 block from the Robinsons over near the cathedral. And so I got to know their family, all of the family members, fairly well, just with that proximity. Roscoe's and Robinsons in one neighborhood. That neighborhood is still recovering. I got to know Mark much better when I got to Carroll College. We participated in football and basketball and student government together. And then as we graduated, we parted ways for a while until Mark and his family moved back to Helena. And then we had many occasions to connect, whether that was through the cathedral, parish, church league basketball, Carroll College activities. And so we have a number of connections for those years. I even had the opportunity and privilege of working with Mark as he was Attorney General and Governor. And I always thank him for that. Great experience. Tonight's discussion, our freedoms, the Constitution, and the rule of law, and an appropriate scripture reference from John 3, verse 11. He knows of what he speaks. Mark has an extensive legal career studying, interpreting, and applying the Constitution and the rule of law. Upon graduation from law school, his first position was a special prosecutor position with the U.S. Army. As he completed his obligation with the Army, he moved back to Missoula and spent a couple years with the Missoula County Attorney Office. Then he received an appointment to the state of Montana, the first special prosecutor for the state of Montana within the Attorney General's office. And he spent 12 years prosecuting major cases throughout the state of Montana. Then he was elected Attorney General. The Attorney General is the top attorney for the state. And so Marc was personally involved in arguing cases in front of the Montana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. In addition, within the Attorney General's office, there are a number of Attorney General opinions that are issued. Those opinions, in many cases, focused on constitutional issues, Montana constitutional issues. And they carry the weight of law until they would be overturned by a court or having legislation passed and change that law. So a significant responsibility. So solid education and extensive experience on constitutional issues and the rule of law. He knows of what he speaks. So I would like to help you, have you help me welcome Governor Marc Racicot tonight.
Thank you, Michael. You're very kind. Mick has a great selective memory. That's all I can, what I can be grateful for. We spent a lot of time, a lot of years together working in state government. It was a joy virtually every day, and I'm grateful for you being so kind to me tonight. Let me begin by offering an apology for anything that I speak about that you already know. And or if I exceed the boundaries of propriety, you can surely straighten that out with me at the conclusion of my remarks. I was once advised by a wise and gentle man, almost reluctantly when he spoke to me, that the secret to a good sermon, and I know that we have our resident priest in the audience tonight, at least for a while, the secret to a good sermon is to have a good beginning and a good end, and to have the two be as close together as possible. So I'm going to try to remember that, with the hope that all of you will view the speaker's brevity as a gift of sorts to each of you. Let me offer to you the notion that I would like to go through a few things just so we get on the same page quickly, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers, hopefully answers, cross-examination if you desire, about any of the things that I happen to mention. Let us start briefly with a prologue. It's not been easy for us as a human race, the journey we've been on, where we've been, and how far we've come. Throughout all of human history, people around the world have tried and experimented with just about every conceivable form of government, conceivable, imaginable, in various attempts to discover how to live together for the long run in freedom and in peace. As you all will recall, it began with the law of the jungle in the beginning, where the strongest prospered and the weak did not. That was followed thereafter over a period of 2,500 years by experience with monarchies, aristocracies, tyrannies, oligarchies, theocracies, colonialism, socialism, communism, and of course, at the end, democracy. But after several millennia and the invention of the printing press, the debates about and experience with various governing structures reached their zenith during the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. The American colonies, having endured the vagaries of an oppressive and distant monarch for almost 2 centuries, along with their own impotent and failed governmental structures, set about to draft in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 what was advertised to be amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Parenthetically, it is important to note, historically, the context was that summer in Philadelphia, the meeting occurred and not all of the designated delegates reported for work and for duty in the beginning. Truly, the past was a prologue to the future that was yet to be written. The first British colony, I'm sure you will recall, was established on the North American continent on the shores of Virginia in 1607. 160 years later, with growing unrest and tension in the colonies, there were 2,000 British soldiers occupying Boston to enforce the tax laws along with 16,000 colonists. Following the Boston Massacre in 1770, rebellion in the colonies continued. The Boston Tea Party occurred, and the First Continental Congress was formed in 1774 in reaction to the British monarch's coercive acts. The Continental Congress would serve as the government of the American colonies for 15 years until 1789. As you all know, I'm certain, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and in 1781 the British were forced to surrender at Yorktown. The fighting, however, would not formally end until 1783, when the peace treaty with Britain was signed, the Treaty of Paris. Since the establishment of the first American colony, 7 generations of Americans had waited 176 years for the independence of the United States to be recognized around the world. Then the question became, how will the future of this new country be preserved? How will it be governed, if at all? It's important to remember that it had taken 5 years to draft the Articles of Confederation, debate them, amend them, and persuade the last state to ratify them. And what did the states agree to by enacting the Articles of Confederation? Article 3 provided the answer. The said states hereby severally enter into a league of friendship with each other. Not a solemn bond, not an unbroken or eternal commitment, one to another and to the whole of the Union, but to a firm league of friendship. There were no provisions to collect taxes, defend the country, pay the public debt, or regulate trade and commerce. The troops during the Revolutionary War lacked boots, food, weapons, ammunition, clothing, and medical care. Public debts continued to go unpaid and continued to be one after another state going with the effort to print their own money, and one, namely Pennsylvania, required that money printed in Pennsylvania had to be kept within its borders. During this period of time, the states also found themselves engaged in more and more boundary disputes. They passed tariff laws, that may sound parenthetically somewhat familiar to you, and imposed upon each other tariffs, one to another. New Jersey had its own customs service, and 9 states had their own navy. You have to have a lot of ships when you have a lot of tariffs. Throughout the years after the Revolutionary War ended, there were continual discussions and proposals offered to amend the Articles of Confederation. But the calls for reform of the Articles went unheeded and were largely ignored. As it happened, however, in 1785, Maryland and Virginia became entangled in a very serious dispute over navigation on the Potomac River. Both states sent commissioners to Mount Vernon to discuss the disagreement. Seeing the chance to enlist the cooperation of neighboring states, the commission was enlarged and set to meet in Annapolis in September 1786. But prior to the Annapolis meeting, on August 29, 1786, Desperate farmers in western Massachusetts, having concluded that they were being ruinously taxed by Boston and suffering the seizure of their property by officials, rose in revolt. Armed with pitchforks and posts, the participants in Shays' Rebellion marched on county courthouses, threatening and wreaking havoc. Although ultimately pardoned, 14 rioting leaders were condemned to death for their insurrection. They took insurrection seriously in those days. Against this backdrop, the Annapolis Commission met in September 1786. Out of that meeting came a recommendation that all 13 states appoint delegates to meet in May 1787 to consider the regulation of trade and commerce. The Continental Congress, proceeding cautiously, resolved that the convention was to be confined for, quote, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Now, it's fair to say that all of the delegates came to the convention at Philadelphia with a determination to restructure the Articles of Confederation. But what happened at the convention was something quite different and extraordinary. By the end of 116 days, its delegates had agreed to go far beyond amending the Articles of Confederation and instead had crafted a constitution for the United States of America, which was ratified by the required majority in 9 states barely 10 months later. So how was it possible for the founders to do what they did? Well, to begin with, there were no political parties yet identified and operative. The delegates were all present in the same room with curtains drawn for 89 days of discussion and argument at Independence Hall. There were procedural rules of conduct agreed upon and observed. There were curtains over the windows, as I mentioned, and the imposition of a rule of confidentiality in order to prevent rumors and misinformation from circulating in the colonies. Most importantly, there was no internet or social media. So it was simply impossible to flood the zone with deafening noise, confusion, and prevarication. Each state had one vote, and a majority of a state's delegates had to be present and agree before the state's vote counted. Each delegate could speak only once on an issue until all of the delegates received the opportunity to speak, and then only with the special permission of the convention delegates. The rules explicitly required the delegates to pay close attention to the presentations by other delegates and forbade the reading of books, documents, or papers while one of the delegates was speaking. Finally, all of the comments were required to be addressed to the President, George Washington, in order to avoid, as much as possible, elevated rhetoric between delegates involved in the same exchange. This year, we celebrate the 249th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the 237th year since the ratification of the United States Constitution, creating what today is the oldest functioning democracy in the history of humankind, and answering Alexander Hamilton's question whether, quote, men and women are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Recent polls have revealed that the percentage of Americans who believe America is in crisis have continually hovered around 75% over the last several years. Recall, if you will, the adjournment of the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. Benjamin Franklin, as he exited Freedom Hall, was asked, "Do we have a monarchy or a republic?" His response was prophetic. "You have a republic if you can keep it." That remains as it did in the beginning, the existential question of our time. Can we keep our republic? And can we keep it if the values and virtues of the rule of law, purposely infused into the Constitution, are not fully and completely observed? By choosing democracy, we simultaneously make a commitment to the preservation of our union. We are then bound by oath and mutual promise to each other to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Montana with fidelity, so help us God. A democracy is a dynamic institution, always changing, but it's fragile, and it can dynamically deteriorate and rot just as quickly as it can dynamically improve. It is literally, legally, and spiritually a social contract between a free and independent people and their government. It is not imposed upon us. We choose it by living together and by the mutual promise we make to each other to faithfully support, protect, and defend the terms of our agreement as it was defined and memorialized in our constitutions. By choosing democracy, we simultaneously make a commitment to the preservation of the Union. Then we are bound by oath and mutual promise to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in our case, the Constitution of the state of Montana, with fidelity, faithfulness. What did the framers of our constitutions intend when they chose fidelity or faithfulness to be the standard that provides guidance for appropriate behavior by every one of us as citizens? Clearly, they envisioned much more than waving a flag. They intended to saturate the Constitution with expectations of faithfulness to the public good and the well-being of our fellow citizens, to the cause and protection of freedom, to a shared set of values and virtues, and to the preservation of the Union. The fidelity referred to in our founding documents is not only faithfulness to the literal words of our constitutions, it also commands faithfulness to the virtues that are embedded in the design and structure of our constitutions. Virtues that are indispensable to the endurance and survival of a free people and a way of life, and virtues that provide the adhesive that hold us together in union with one another. It's not really a big ask. I'm not suggesting, hopelessly, a return to simpler times. I'm hoping for a return to simple, timeless, and enduring values, presuming the best of each other, listening in good faith before acting or responding, exuding generosity and grace, self-correcting our own mistakes, and being ambitious to accomplish something, not to be somebody. I'm suggesting that we focus on caring and listening to each other, seeing and hearing with our hearts, gathering the facts before we make up our minds, and then actually fixing our society's problems instead of being distracted by the flashing lights, engaging in the to and fro of never-ending, coarse and careless electronic communications that can be dispatched at the speed of light with a silent click to every corner of the planet Earth and beyond, billions of times a second. Sadly, we hear so much about divisions. We are conditioned by modern media to think that we have little in common as a nation and as a people. But I truly believe the majority of the American people, the great middle of America, are tired of the intramural wars, where all sides emphasize only their divisions with the hope of having them magnified and instantaneously scattered across the landscape, courtesy of the internet and the propaganda incessantly pervaded by political hucksters of both political parties. As one precocious Montanan told me at her 8th grade graduation in Biddle, Montana, parenthetically, I don't know how many of you have been to Biddle, but if you haven't, you shouldn't miss it. As one precocious young Montanan, she was the only graduate at her 8th grade graduation in Biddle, told me, years ago, over 25 years ago, we are not different groups of people in America. We are, she said, one group of different Americans. One group of different Americans. It would do us well and serve all of humanity well to remember that. We've got problems in this country and in our states, so let us rediscover and refresh those values and those beliefs that bind us together in freedom, independence, and stability. Let us quickly and completely abandon the solitary and destructive search for power and control, and get on about fixing our problems and taking care of one another with fidelity. So help us God. Thank you. So, it's time for cross-examination. I certainly am delighted to answer any questions you might have and have some dialogue for as long as you'd like to stay. I can surely try. As you know, that was an ultimate disaster for the political life of the country when corporations were giving the same treatment as human beings. And it's actually a very simple concept I have learned that we didn't ever recognize or set about to activate within the states across the country. The theory is this, and I think it's sound. Corporations, by law, are only creatures that are artificial and entitled to the prerogatives and powers that are provided by the state. So those creatures were created by the state. They can be governed by the states. That's how all of the various states across the country began competing for the placement of businesses, railroads, banks, everything other business there was under the sun, and also allowing them corporate recognition, thereby providing a certain immunity to those who were the stockholders of the company. And throughout that process, they were granted powers that continued to expand, each state trying to outdo the other. They got to the point to where ultimately they summarized everything they had to offer to various different corporations and people around the country. They summarized by proclaiming that every corporation that is incorporated by the laws of the state pursuant to the conditions set by the state would be recognized as an independent entity and have the same powers as any human being would have. That last phrase is not precisely the language they used, but that's precisely what they intended. So that's why you find a lot of corporations incorporated in Delaware, because they got very aggressive and they made the place very, very welcoming to corporations to incorporate in their state, developed a court system around it, and were very advanced in terms of providing state charters. So it literally became uniform over the course of time and outside the gaze of most people in the United States of America, including me, that corporations were assuming these powers. Well, if they have all of the powers according to human beings, they have the right to free speech. So the theory of the case is this, that if you revoke all of the powers that are presently granted by the state of Montana to those corporate entities, and then provide them back all of those powers but for the right of free speech, then you will address the issues surrounding Citizens United and the obscene campaign finance laws that we have presently. So it's a very, very simple theory. It appears to me to have a great deal of weight and credibility associated with it. I think the people of Montana are overwhelmingly in favor of it. The polling recently reveals between 75 and 80% plurality support the passage of the initiative, provided it makes it through the Supreme Court. And as a consequence of that, could then change dramatically, and Montana is the only state doing this at the moment, could change dramatically campaign finance in the United States of America. I mean, it's absolutely obscene, the amount of money that is spent on politics in this day and age, and most of us can't stand it for longer than a few seconds because it's so bitter and angry and harsh. It corrodes and corrupts the soul and the heart of America. And as a consequence of that, I think everyone has great hope. It'll be a long, probably lonely journey getting signatures, although I suspect that David will be involved back there trying to aid and abet, he and Sandy, great citizens of the state of Montana, and believe very much, I believe, in this particular initiative. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, Bob. Well, I can't follow him even without Jesus. I think I understand the import of the question. I'm sorry to be a little bit dismissive. The fact of the matter is that he's not the only person on the planet who doesn't recognize what it is that we're all about as a community of interest in the United States of America. The Constitution was as much a reflection of the spiritual growth and posture of the early colonies as it was about arranging for the powers of states to be utilized on behalf of the people that lived within them. So the notion that somehow the Constitution doesn't have to do with the spiritual context within which people live, it's just absolutely wrong. I mean, it's illogical. Think for a moment, when you think about according respect, one of the virtues that Montesquieu articulated and talked about when he drafted his thesis about a democracy existing and how it could remain stable and always focused upon those things that kept that union bound together. Those things are very simple values and virtues, respecting another human being, according them the same amount of credibility and the ability to participate as any other human being. Those things sound awfully much like the right to assemble to me, and the right to be free from unlawful search and seizure, and the presumption being placed upon those who allege a violation of the law rather than those who are accused. I mean, you can go through the Constitution and look at the Bill of Rights, and you can match up every single one of those rights reserved to the people with a religious tenet that you and I happen to believe in and have believed in throughout our almost 80 years on the planet now. So it depends upon the perspective with which you approach the document and the union, the language that you're going to speak to describe it. So it can either be providence or it can be coincidence. But whatever it is, at the end of the day, we understand that there are legal tenets that must be observed. If somebody were to ask me, is there a national office holder or somebody occupying the White House today that recognizes, appreciates, and upholds the Constitution on a daily basis, the answer is I don't know anybody that fits that description, because it's almost habitual, it's almost expected. There's a new outrage every single day that ultimately calls into question our capacity to live in freedom and in liberty by according each other the same virtues and values that we hope they accord to us. So this is a very dangerous moment in the history of this country. As was mentioned earlier, we come to democracy by choice, not because we have to. And if we can't talk to each other, if we can't listen to each other, if we can't take care of each other, when we can stop at a four-way stop, by the way, and never miss a beat, how can we live together? There has to be more than at least 50% of the population that believes in the Constitution and what it stands for, and is prepared to make the sacrifices and the contributions to our communities that allow for all of us to try and live with some degree of prosperity and decency and of caretaking by those who are in difficult circumstances. So really, there's nothing. I realized in 2016, there was no way I was going down that road. And to me, I know that it might be of some offense to some people to argue just in religious terms. But to me, the Constitution is very much a spiritual document. And it's the ideal that we set about to achieve, recognizing how imperfect we are and that we're going to fall and stumble many times in the process, but there will be enough of us committed to those principles and values to take care of the country and to defend it in any circumstance where it's assaulted or confronted. So, to me, there's no difference. There's a difference between political parties and the Constitution, and Washington pointed that out with a great deal of specificity, and one of the strongest statements he ever made. He was absolutely convinced they would be the demise of America, because you would end up with cunning men and women setting about to gather, control, and seek power as a chief objective over the course of time, and as a consequence would leave those who were abiding by these spiritual tenets of our Constitution and adhering to each other with this common belief, and ultimately experience the destruction of the country. And that's what's happening right now, piece by piece, chunk by chunk, is that Constitution gets denied. It's ignored. It's never given its due for what it is that it provides for all of us. To me, it's astounding when you think about it. I mentioned a four-way stop. You know, we come to a four-way stop, and we all stop. I mean, it's rare I ever see anybody speed through a four-way stop. How is it that, because we know we'll get our chance, they'll get their chance, we have to bargain back and forth spiritually and mentally, not verbally, hopefully, sometimes I suspect that happens, and we'll each get our turn. And almost inevitably, there's no violation of a four-way stop. How is it that we can do that there, then, and in that moment, and not practice the same dynamics, the same habits, the same discipline that we can within our general political world? There's no excuse for it. And I mean, I would guess that most people here tonight have a feeling coursing through their veins that there's just something not right in America. And that may be a large reason why you want to talk about it, because it doesn't seem that it's going to end. But let me offer you some notions of that are positive, I think, some intuitions that reveal that, in fact, the great middle of America is awakening. You know, most people don't feel comfortable, at least when the house I grew up in, talking about their politics or putting it on their sleeves every single day, advertising and beating on doors and screaming and yelling and carrying on this banter and discussion that ends up being usually coarse and corrosive and angry and full of very little substance. In addition to that, we're basically private creatures most of the time. And as a consequence, we're fearful sometimes of being judged and not being seen to be in keeping with what the majority think about a given issue. And as a consequence of that kind of cordiality, that kind of, attributing the kind of respect and dignity to people individually, we don't get a lot of people jumping and screaming on the streets. And so it appears as if we may be a bit tired. But I think that there are some signs of late that indicate that, in fact, America is awakening. When I first started 3 years ago, I guess it was back in 2016 I started, and it was a little bit unnerving, frankly, because I had made up my mind at that point. Parties mean nothing to me in the hierarchy of values when compared to my faith, compared to my country, compared to my family. And as a consequence of that, whatever label I may or may not have labored under before became irrelevant to me. And as a consequence, I kept looking for levers. Where could we influence, as a great middle of America, what it is that's going on in the country? Well, the first chance we had probably was with the impeachment. But frankly, and I don't mean to be overly harsh, but we can't find enough collective courage in the United States Congress to do anything about that particular issue. And so as a consequence, when it should have been called clean, and that should have been a yes vote, it didn't happen. That was our first experience with what might possibly be occurring in the future. The second one was when there was a disqualification of one of the candidates, ultimately decided by the United States Supreme Court in error. And there are some reasons perhaps to explain that, but nonetheless, the second opportunity that the people of this country had to make known what it is that they thought disqualified you and which was contained within the Constitution did not happen because of the United States Supreme Court. The third possibility is the election of 2026. But lo and behold, and unsurprising as we have become, we now have people trying to game that system as well. But during the legislature this last session, there were 9 young Republicans that came to the deliberative body up on the Hill, and they were all relegated to a committee, or many of them, to a committee that had no duties. And as a consequence, they were slightly elevated in mood. And as a consequence of that, it was a certain bonding that occurred between them. And they also came because they wanted to do what was right rather than what was convenient or what the party expected. And the party is nothing more than people, a very tiny cabal that ends up on a daily basis trying to accumulate power and authority so that they can sculpt the world and your life and my life the way they see fit without any kind of input from you. So these young Republicans actually ended up teaming up with 17 Democrats, and as a consequence of that, they had an ability to block things that occurred within the Senate, and they did it. First of all, they expanded Medicaid beyond a temporary provision to a permanent status. Secondly, they funded schools. There were a number of other bills that they sent to their demise, and as a consequence, it revealed to me that there are some people who are being elected to office doing the right things for the right reason at the right time. Footnote, unfortunately, that doesn't include our congressional delegation. And the fact of the matter is, too, that you now see the election of November 4th. That was a pretty demonstrative message sent by the people of this country. It took the transcendence of a lot of people above their normal political impulse to draw a conclusion and to sense with wariness the level of danger in this country. And as a consequence, you saw all of those elections that went in a direction that you could have never predicted by polling or anything else. So 2 Democrat governors elected, and frankly, that's where I'm going to be. I mean, I want a House or a Senate that can provide some friction to, and some testing and some introspection for the political system. So if that means getting a different party, whatever lever that's legal and ethical that I can perceive for me, maybe not for you, but for me, I'm going to employ, I'm going to root for, and I'm going to try to make happen. And the fact of the matter is that we also saw, in addition to that election, the one in California, which was a miracle in my judgment. I mean, you had people of every color, shape, disposition, economic status, waiting in lines for hours to vote. And the vote, they knew exactly what was going on. That somebody was trying to pull a fast one, and they may be the stop point for whatever it was that was going to occur. And frankly, that vote was 2-1. There were 2 million votes that separated the winner and the loser. Think about that. It occurred within 60 days, or 60 or 80 days, and they were able to inform enough of their fellow citizens about what was taking place in the country to stand up from wherever they were and to do something about it. And that's really a good lesson for us, because The people founded this country, and really the point of going through all those dates and times is this, that it took us a long time to get here as a human race. And the gift of a democracy, the gift of a republic, was not easily earned. A lot of people suffered and died over a great many years to provide us that blessing. And I think, frankly, if any of you are like me, I may have forgotten that a little bit up until a few years ago, how blessed I was to live in this country where we have a democratic republic. I can be heard, I can have a private life, I can make judgments that are not going to be upset by the state. All of those freedoms that we reserve unto ourselves, I end up having as a gift. And not every country on the planet has that chance. So I think that what we're seeing here is a little bit of the turning of the screw. One other thing, and now I'll shut up. I follow the polls a lot, and I don't believe in them very much, to be honest. In the old days, you could probably attribute more credibility to them than you can now. But nonetheless, they're at least one indication of what it is that's going on in the country. And when you take a look at polls, you typically look, or what I look for, is a net approval. And so you take the approval rate, you subtract the disapproval rate, and you end up with a net either approval or disapproval. Well, there were only 8 to 10 states in my memory that ended up with a net approval of the presently serving office holder in the White House. Every single state that voted for him the last time, all those action states, the battleground states you hear about, he's underwater in by anywhere from 6 to 20 points. In those states, there are 96 electoral votes. If those 96 electoral votes had gone the other way, there would be no presidency of Donald Trump presently. And so we started the country, our ancestors, by we I mean the people. We have the power to do something about it. It's not as efficient as unelecting somebody or impeaching somebody or disqualifying somebody, but ultimately we are the sovereign and we have the power if we have the capacity, the courage, and the commitment to do it. And there are a lot of simple ways to do it, from writing letters to the editor, to the people in Congress, to being engaged in actions that you think are responsible, and at least allow for people to discern your disapproval of given situations or circumstances, talking to your friends, your family, your neighbors. I don't know about everybody here, but I've had some of my strongest arguments with members of the family. Go figure. So there are ways we can do this, and being here tonight, recognizing how many times it has been done, I'm absolutely convinced that we can get it accomplished if we all stay engaged. So anyway, long answer to a question, Bob, that I don't think I addressed. Yes.
Could you make a comment about today's United States Supreme Court and how it seems to not be functioning
I have a theory.
as the Supreme Court should
Yeah.
function?
Well, you know, when you think about it, people are on pins and needles. And think about for a moment that you've got the United States Supreme Court that issues orders. First of all, the system so ideally devised and conceptualized by the founders with its built-in friction points, one of them being the courts, probably never envisioned, we could say with some degree of safety, the days of the internet, the speed with which things can be done. The judiciary was always, without the power of the purse or the power of waging battle, it was always meant to call a timeout, to preserve the status quo until the facts and the circumstances were determined. So it's not equipped by design with speed. That's one issue. And so when you hear about things, let me just finish addressing that topic. When you hear about things like the shadow docket, that they put it on the shadow docket, kind of an unfortunate term. In essence, what they're saying is they issued an injunction to preserve everything as it is today until such time as they can hear the case. And, since the advent of this administration, there are in excess of 500 different lawsuits in the system, and they're working their way up to the court. So each one of them requires briefing. Each one of them requires argument, typically. Each one of them requires a decision about whether an injunction is going to be issued or not. So it was not designed for speed. It was designed for accuracy and clarity and good judgment. And its design with the advent of the internet has made that incredibly difficult. Secondly, when a court issues an order, who do we know executes it? It's the United States Marshals. They don't have their own capacity to enforce judgments. And guess who the United States Marshals work for? Ultimately, the Attorney General. So, and that, in essence, provides a big issue, a problem. And I think what's going on, having had some introduction to some of those people, is that they're tenuous and on pins and needles because they're concerned about the day when one judgment after another is denied and the executive branch refuses to enforce it. And while at the same time accumulating power and capacity within the military, that I think is presenting them, now this is just my theory, having known three of them though, however, to make certain that they don't go so far as to tip the scales and upset the bucket and we end up with a Supreme Court that actually becomes a nullity. So I think they're being overly cautious to provide appropriate process. That means if one court in the Ninth Circuit issues a ruling and then another, they've got two cases where each one of those courts had one, and they proceed at different paces and different times, different places, and you end up with a situation where they're not speedy. So I'm disappointed because I think they have lacked the courage to issue rulings that they indicated in their Senate hearings that they were inclined to be bound by. And that's just judicial interpretation rules. I'm not looking for a result, but the rules call for you, if you really believe in the system, to respect the judgments that have been already drawn by the court in the past. So they didn't do that, and in a number of cases. So it's I would be concerned too. I'm concerned, but I wonder if they're not proceeding with great caution and erring on the side of providing, losing. They don't want to lose their capacity to continue to perform the function by losing the people of this country. It's the wrong reason to be in that posture, but it nonetheless is my belief that that's what's happening.
But what about the immunity for the president?
Yeah, I don't buy that either. Washington D.C. is a funny place, and the presidency is it's so inbred, and the presidency and the White House are powerful structures of power and discretion and respect, and it's not a kingdom, but it's not far behind, and there's so much depends on the person that holds the office. And, we have been blessed, even when we've disagreed. In my lifetime, my first president that I remember was Dwight Eisenhower. And of course, we had some exceptions to the rule, like Richard Nixon. But the people in the office are critically important. Their persona, their discipline, their nobility, their respect for America and for the people of America, and the respect for the office. And that's not present within every human being. And I mean, I'm amazed at how much authority they have, and we never even thought about it or presumed would be appropriate. And it's like, sinking ships in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. I mean, we're used to having some evidence to support action, and there is no evidence that the public is aware of at all. And as a consequence of that, we're left in the dark. Are these people just being eliminated? Are they extrajudicial killings that are totally inappropriate and maybe murder? I mean, I understand the drug issues, I believe, as well as anybody can. But at the end of the day, in this country, we have always claimed to act with discretion and the recognition that people are presumed innocent until they are found guilty by competent evidence. So, I mean, these aren't just throwaways. These are people, 83 people in 21 different instances. And we can't even tell, at least I'm not certain they have any evidence, to be honest. Yes, sir.
Can you touch on the top two, primary versus party?
Yes, the primaries. I was a big fan of top two because I thought it would invite more people into the process. I think I was a little bit short-sighted to begin with, but I had time to correct my impression and my views when I realized the potential and the capacity for top four with a rated system that allowed for you to have more than one candidate, four ultimately, that we could choose from when they went into the general election. So I think it's fabulous. Let me just tell you a little bit about parties. I know a little bit about parties. Not a lot, to be honest. You're going to be surprised at how dim I am. When I ran for office, I didn't know what I was because I had been in law enforcement for the first 20, 25 years of my life. And my dad, I think, was a Democrat. At least he loved Franklin Roosevelt because he was a child of the Depression. He was a Marine. He had strong feelings about how his family was taken care of and looked after and how the country reacted during those perilous times. And I think my mother was a Republican, although they didn't argue politics all the time. It was not something they wore on their sleeves. And so it was not critically important. When I got approached about running for partisan office, Michael James Robinson avoided mentioning the fact that I had been successful running for Attorney General. But the fact of the matter is, I lost the three races that I first tried for. I ran for judicial positions and was defeated. First time I ran for the Supreme Court. Get this. I was thinking to myself at the time, John Driscoll was a young child prodigy in those days as well, but he was very successful, and I wasn't. I kept thinking to myself, well, I didn't like traveling away from 5 children all the time and leaving Teresa and those 5 babies out in the North Valley while I was off special prosecuting all over the state of Montana. And the Supreme Court race for Chief Justice came along, and I thought, I think I could be a good judge. I was only 32. But, Thomas Jefferson was 32 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Why wouldn't I have thought that? So I entered the race, much to the great chagrin and surprise of most of the people who knew me. And a lot of them thought I needed a mental status exam. And I ran against one of the most extraordinary people you'd ever want to meet, Chief Justice Frank Haswell, who had presided over the adoption of my brother, for God's sakes. And he was a Marine too, as was my dad. So here I am in the middle of this race. And it's probably not going to come as a surprise, but I was defeated soundly. And the second time I decided to run for the court, there was a position open in Lewis and Clark County and Broadwater County. And so I filed for that position. Well, I was beaten again, but only by 300 votes this time. I thought, if I had 151 votes changed, I would have been successful. So that has to be within my grasp, I thought. So the third time, was 2 years later when they created a new judgeship in Lewis and Clark County. So I ran again, and we worked so hard. It takes 18 months to do this in those days, and you have to walk the streets and impose upon people's time and ask them for money, and you learn a lot. What I learned is you don't have to be afraid of losing, because I lost the third time too. And so, I was deciding to go into private practice. I had all these kids going to school and starting college, and I was going to move to Malta, be a Malta Mustang, because a lawyer up there had offered me a job. So Teresa and I drove to Malta, and after 290 miles away, we thought, I don't know if this is going to work out. And so I came back, and I was looking to go into private practice. And Bob Brown, a really good friend of mine, who served in the legislature, I'm sure all of you know, and as Secretary of State for a long time. Interestingly, I shouldn't get so carried away with these stories, but they're such charming events to me. When I was in college, myself, Joe Mazurik, one of the dearest friends I ever had, and Mike Cooney, Newell Anderson, Forrest Anderson's son, Chet Blaylock was the son of Chet Blaylock, J.D. Lynch from Butte, and Bob was from the university, and I was at Carroll. We were all student body presidents. So we all knew each other from the time we were in college. And so when they all got involved in the political life of the country, I was trying a lot of cases, but they were genuine political scientists. And so after I'd lost the third race, Bob came to me and said, you ought to run for Attorney General. And I said, I don't know what party I am, because I voted all over the ballot. I still do. I've never voted a straight ballot. And so, but I looked at the platforms, and I thought, yeah, I can live with this, I think. And there was no candidate for the Republicans, and Brown was urging me to run. And my dad was very sick at the time. In fact, he died before the race was over. But an interesting kind of a comical story, I went to tell him I was going to run. And he'd been involved in all the other three campaigns. And he said, he called upon the Lord, I would say in gentle terms. And he said, why would you do that? We tried 3 times, we lost 3 times. And I said, I just think, Dad, there's a place out there for me. I want to continue in public service. And I said, that's not the worst news. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm going to run as a Republican. And he called on the Lord a second time. And so then he was in the process, he just didn't last very long. He was very sick. But on his deathbed, on the last day of his life, I went in, I was with him, sitting in his room. He was a character, I got to tell you. And he was lying down, his eyes were closed, and that rattling breathing was taking place. But every once in a while he'd wake up. And he woke up one time, he looked at me and he said, I voted for Reagan. and I called on the Lord. And I said to him, and then he opened his eyes again and he said, twice. So it's no wonder I'm a schizophrenic politician. And, I was labeled as a rhino from the first moment I walked in. So I've never been really good at it, but I do know something about the political life of the country. And that is this. That it's not sinister. There's no crimes. It's just a group of people that sometimes I probably unfairly refer to as a cabal that get engaged, want control. We all want control. We want control of everything, of our kids, of our spouses, of the events that surround our lives. It's just a natural impulse, part of the competitive instinct, I think. So nobody can be condemned for that. But, they make decisions on the basis of how they are personally aligned. There's no dispassionate judgment here. So they decide who's going to get the money within the party because they have limited amounts to assign. They're going to decide who gets the surrogates to go out and speak on behalf. They're going to be the people that try to persuade the other members of the party to support one candidate or another. So it's a real discouragement to engaging more people. And what we need are more people to bring the variety and the fresh perspective into the process. It's dependent on that. Although parenthetically, I was a supporter of term limits. One of the biggest mistakes I've made, other than running against Frank Caswell, big mistake. We discharged so much knowledge and intuition about the system, and so much goodwill. Those people served admirably well. They were always focused on the public good, Democrat or Republican, and they did a marvelous job. So that was a mistake. So you asked, what about the primaries? Well, it's a long way back, isn't it?
It's been enjoyable.
At the end of the day, the more people we can get engaged, the better. And I know it's uncomfortable to first-time candidates, but the nation needs them at every level to infuse new energy, new perspective, a forgiveness of sins that you may have kept track of over the span of your career. Just newness to bring into the system, and a lot more, if you don't mind me saying, women involved in the system. I had the privilege of working with an equal number of women and men, and the best offices I ever worked in were those that had a good balance of both. And a lot of the young people I've been involved with over the last 3 years, a lot of them are young mothers who are deathly afraid of what's happening to their country. And they're smart, and they're bright, and even with children, they're working their hearts out, trying to make a difference. And so that's why I like the nonpartisan ballot, so we can get more people engaged. Lisa Murkowski wouldn't be a senator without it. The representative from Alaska wouldn't be in the House of Representatives without it. So it demonstrates the will of the people in more precise terms. So I love it. But you talk to the parties, and they're both the same. Neither one of them want it because they lose control. Yes, sir. Well, the enforcement of ICE, the enforcement mechanisms, and their typical protocol to take matters under control is nothing that I think is appropriate or close or comports with standard law enforcement techniques. So that's an abuse of position. That's not a fundamental, seminal difficulty with the system. In terms of the intelligence agencies, I haven't had that same experience. I'm certain there's a lot I don't know. But I'm also certain that the intelligence community, by and large, almost overwhelmingly without exception, are incredibly capable people who are focused on doing the right things for the right reasons. And I think the impeachment hearings demonstrated that in admirable terms. But I do understand that people are suspicious of intelligence and intelligence gathering agencies. I don't know how to dissuade you, but my view is that they operate in good faith and that they're absolutely critical to the safety of the country. Yes, sir.
Governor Racicot, I was wondering if you would share some of your thoughts on separation of powers.
Absolutely, I would.
Well, as I watch Congress sacrificing their powers to the executive branch or the executive branch, pressuring the judicial branch to prosecute certain individuals, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think your summary is precisely correct. And the fact of the matter is there by design. It's like, I'm astounded sometimes by the President of the United States evincing some surprise that the courts may get involved and that the orders of the court may not be necessarily observed. He was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and the inquisitor asked him whether or not he was responsible for protecting and defending the Constitution. And he said he didn't know. And frankly, I mean, that's a quote, I don't know. And by his actions and by his own statements, I take it that he doesn't know. That's an incredible danger to the country, because the system was designed for some dynamic tension existing between the three branches. It's just like personal relationships, like a husband and wife. There's a certain amount of friction on certain days that ends up producing perhaps more information and the capacity to make a judgment about something that you would not have been universally invested with yourself. At least that's how my spouse operates. And she's right. So it's a horrible constitutional violation to disassemble the functions of the court, to ignore them, and to expect that there's no penalty to be paid. Because what's going to happen is that we don't have that independent body whose purpose is to decide controversies. There's always going to be a winner and a loser. It just shows an incredible lack of depth about the operative mechanisms of the Constitution and the judicial branch. I don't know how to cure that except to unelect them. And those who adhere to the pontifications and the daily outrage, calling judges lunatic and stupid and incapable, those who tolerate that, which is us, at the end of the day are probably partially responsible. This guy gets away with murder every day. And we're the only ones that can stop it. I thought we had more efficient means of doing that, but I mentioned before, we lost the impeachment, we lost disqualification, we lost the election. So we have to do it the hard way. And the hard way is us. And I'm absolutely convinced we can do it. But we have to all be engaged in it. Yes? Absolutely. Well, I was an Army prosecutor for 3 years, and I can tell you, based upon that, and a careful rereading of the Uniform Code of Military Justice over the last couple of days, the fact of the matter is, as you know, because you probably know, that an illegal order provides no defense or immunity to a person that ends up being responsible for a death or a murder on the high seas. I mean, it is those who carry out the order, because he's immune. Those who carry out the order who are going to be liable, potentially, based upon the evidence, for the homicides that are occurring on the high seas. So the Uniform Code of Military Justice is very clear, very plain, and it says at the end of the day, without excuse or justification, a homicide is a murder, that's their language in the code, for which you are responsible. And no alleged order given by somebody else can exonerate you in a murder case. So they could potentially be liable for murder. I know it, but when their excuse is a crime, in other words, by refusing to, by issuing the order that's illegal, they have a responsibility to determine the illegality. That's what's in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And they have to determine whether it's legal or not legal. And if it's not, in the Uniform Code, they have a responsibility to speak up and disobey. I was wondering that myself, but I think no, because they're not members. It only applies to members of the armed forces, but not to the commander-in-chief, odd as that seems. Commander-in-chief. Yes, sir.
So to get back to the Citizens United thing, is our Attorney General going to block the proposition that we're putting forward?
Well, it's presently before him to determine if the language is appropriate. There's a lot of construction rules that apply to the approval for an initiative to be placed on the ballot that the Attorney General typically provides. So it's possible. He has already sent back a reworked statement of what the initiative does. And that's on appeal to the Montana Supreme Court. We should know virtually every single day whether or not they're going to uphold the AG or not. But I don't know if you want an opinion from somebody like me, but the things they're against, they'll find some means or method rather than exercising fair and competent judgment to find a way to do something to derail it. And that's happened numerous times. And that's the real sin, in my judgment, when you know the difference and you go ahead and do it anyway. That's the lack of honor. That's the lack of virtue that the Constitution is talking about. That's the lack of respect for other human beings. That's the lack of confidence in the people you live with, and that they can't make an appropriate judgment for the right reasons. Anyway, I interrupted you.
Successful?
What's that?
Is the Attorney General going to be successful in your opinion?
I don't know. I don't think so. The briefing that I've read appears to me to be persuasive on the part of the petitioner, namely the people trying to get the initiative passed. I know, doesn't it just stink sometimes?
It does.
Do you feel like the Citizens United is a result of judicial activism?
Well, no, because it was pretty plain. The individual states had declared corporations, they had given them the power to be treated as citizens, to be treated as human beings. And one of the rights reserved to the people by the Bill of Rights is to speak their mind, to exercise free speech. And so if the corporation, by act of law, by the determination of the legislature on behalf of the people, is considered a human being, which was probably totally unneeded and unnecessary at the time, but for 200 years, or close, we're getting there, more than that, 237 years, they've been handing out those powers. So I don't think that was a stretch. I could never agree with it, but you could understand the logic. No. I'm not sure they've read the Constitution.
Including our delegation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm serious. I went with that long recitation of historical dates and years that passed that I went through with you earlier was meant, maybe I missed the mark, to communicate how long and how difficult it is for us to get here. And one of our failings along the way, just of relatively recent vintage, is our failure to properly provide education K through 12 and in our university system about American government and the history of this country. And as a consequence of that, we're paying the price somewhat for that now, for not having remembered to do that. We all got so carried away with technology development and all the investments that were being made and all the miracles we were experiencing that we switched a lot of the focus within educational institutions, public and private, toward those particular enterprises and their capacity, rather than sticking with the building blocks of properly being exposed to what a miraculous country we have. Well, you've been very kind. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for the time.